and as the outgoing chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Palestine, I pay particular tribute to colleagues who have been such powerful advocates for peace, justice and security in this troubled land, not least the Honourable Member for Sunderland Central, who will be taking over as chair of the APPG, and I wish her well. I'd like to start by setting out three core principles which I hope and believe are shared by all who are taking part in this debate. First, this is not about religion or ethnicity. It is not a question of Arab, Muslim or Jewish identity. It is about upholding the universal norms and values that we hold dear. And it is about working to constrain and reverse the actions of those who seek to undermine those norms and values. Neither is this about being pro-Israel or pro-Palestine. This is about striving for peace, justice and security for all. Second, we condemn violence in all its forms, whether it is Hamas launching rockets or the IDF bombarding Gaza or bulldozing Bedouin villages to make way for illegal settlements. We oppose any and all actions that lead to the death and destruction that have so tragically come to define this conflict. And third, we believe passionately in the rule of law. Indeed, our point of departure is that the rule of law is not up for negotiation. It is not some bargaining chip that can be tossed onto the table in exchange for concessions or compromises. It is the very cornerstone of the rules-based order and the bedrock of the norms, rights and values that we cherish and seek to defend. And I believe that our defence of the rule of law matters more now than it has done at any time since 1945. Because we stand today at a moment in history where the rule of law is under threat across the world. The Chinese Communist Party has breached the Sino-British Declaration on Hong Kong. The Russian government annexed Crimea in 2014. And deeply regrettably, even our own government is willing to renege on its commitment to a legally binding treaty. But Israel's consistent flouting of UN resolutions and the Fourth Geneva Convention have undermined the rules-based order for decades, and the international community can no longer just look the other way. Both sides in this conflict have witnessed horrific bloodshed, and both sides deserve an end to the fear and suffering that they have had to experience. This is why it is so vital and urgent that the rule of law be brought to bear as the foundation upon which a viable and sustainable Palestine can be negotiated and built. A Palestine which protects the rights of its citizens and lives in peace with its neighbours. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the illegal Israeli settlements undermine all three of the principles that I have set out. They drive and amplify the vicious identity politics that poisons this conflict. They cause violence on a daily basis, and they are a flagrant breach of international law. And yet they continue and they expand. 2018 marked 25 years since the signing of the Oslo Accords. That moment in 1993 was meant to herald a new and lasting era of peace and coexistence, the beginning of a genuine two-state solution. But since 1993, the number of illegal settlers has increased from 258,000 to more than 610,000. 50,000 homes and properties have been demolished, and an illegal separation barrier has been built, which carves up the West Bank and brutally disconnects towns, cities, families and communities from each other. And what have the Israeli people experienced in that time? Insecurity, fear of attacks through suicide bombings, rockets and mortars, knife attacks or car rammings. None of this will end whilst there is no proper peace and no end to the occupation. It has been a disaster for all sides in this conflict. I will give way.
And I congratulate him in the very, very balanced way that he's bringing forward the debate today. The events of the recent weeks have encouraged myself and probably encouraged many, so have they encouraged the Honourable Gentleman as well? And they have shown that the 70-year unresolved conflict between Israel and the Arabs will no longer be allowed to define regional dynamics and relations. And I hope I can use this, does my honourable friend agree with me that this new outside-in approach to peace offers a very invaluable opportunity to transform the entire region? There's an opportunity now to move forward together with perhaps maybe a two-state solution.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention, and we certainly welcome any steps towards peace and conflict resolution. But I do think we should be realistic about what the so-called Abraham Accords really signify. And the reality is that the UAE and Israel have never been at war with each other. They have a pre-existing and long-standing relations. Indeed, they have cooperated on military matters and in counter-revolutions and coups in many of the Arab League states. So I think we should be realistic that this is really more the formalisation of pre-existing relations rather than something new. But nevertheless, it is something to be welcomed. I will give way.
I thank the honourable gentleman, and he made some very, very important and strong points in his opening remarks. Can I bring him back to the reference he made a few moments ago to the signing of the Oslo Accords and the failure that it didn't result in the era of peace that so many people hoped for? Straight after mentioning Oslo, he then talked about settlements, almost implying that it was the issue of settlements that meant that the aspirations behind Oslo were never realised. I would encourage the honourable gentleman to read Bill Clinton's account of the peace negotiations and many other accounts and see why exactly peace wasn't struck when there was an opportunity, and it wasn't the Israelis that walked away from that opportunity.
I thank the honourable gentleman for those comments, and I agree that missed opportunities have been missed on all sides. There's no doubt about that. But the reality is that the constant feature of everything that's happened since 1993 has been the expansion of the settlements. They are a flagrant breach of international law, and once you start to erode the foundations of international law on which all of these negotiations are based, they are rendered effectively meaningless. And I think we do need to bear that in mind as we look back on what has happened since 1993, but it's also vital that we look forward with hope and optimism to the future. It is against this backdrop that President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu have come forward with their so-called deal of the century. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this is not a deal. It is not a plan. It is not even a starting point for talks. This is a proposal that is fundamentally flawed because it has no basis in law. It is a land and power grab, which would mean Israel seizing around 40% of the West Bank with full military and security control over the Palestinian people and their resources. Which government, in its right mind, would ever agree to such terms? Why would the Palestinian Authority ever enter into talks on the basis of a document that effectively legitimizes attempts to destroy any chance of an independent, sovereign Palestine? I will give way.
Thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. Does the honourable member not think that actually the deal of the century could well have been the starting point for a conversation? Yes, there was a lot that was disagreed with on both sides, but there was also elements that could be agreed, and it's those levels where agreement could be sought that could be moved forward to actually deliver that two-state solution that everyone on both sides of this house ultimately want.
I thank the honourable gentleman, but if one is seeking to restart negotiations, one needs to do that on the basis of a plan that it has legitimacy. And you cannot move forward if your plan is actually based on breaking the law. Countless UN resolutions have pointed out that the settlements as they stand are illegal. And so that has to be taken off the table before you even have the basis for starting to talk. And that's why it's perfectly understandable why the Palestinian Authority is refusing to engage on that basis. The Foreign Secretary and his ministers continue to present the Trump-Netanyahu plan as a basis for talks. They ask the Palestinians to compromise. Yet, the Palestinians have already ceded 78% of their land to Israel. How much more can they be asked to compromise?
Will my honourable friend give way?
I will give way.
I'm grateful to him for giving way. Does he agree with me that given Britain's unique history in relation to Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, it's important that our government remains or continues to work at being an honest broker rather than taking sides, and that position that the UK government has taken is actually putting at risk Britain being seen as an honest broker?
I thank my honourable friend and agree entirely. This country has a unique place in history and a unique responsibility, particularly if we trace this back, of course, to the Balfour Declaration. And it is vital that everything that this government says and does honours the commitments in that declaration. The Foreign Secretary and ministers also say that the Palestinian side should make a counter-offer. Well, they have. A two-state solution as already set out in countless UN resolutions and based on 1967 lines. That is the counter-offer. Prime Minister Netanyahu's coalition had agreed that Israel would begin de jure annexation from the 1st of July. Thankfully, the Israeli government has rowed back from this for now. But what we are instead witnessing is more annexation by stealth. Netanyahu has announced approval of preliminary plans for 3,500 new housing units in a new settlement in the E1 area between Jerusalem and Ma'ale Adumim, thus severing East Jerusalem's contiguity with the rest of the West Bank. I will.
I'm very grateful for giving way, and he's making an excellent speech. Does he agree with me that the developments he's now describing pose a threat to the feasibility of a two-state solution because there won't be enough left for a viable state in Palestine to be established?
I agree entirely with my honourable friend. If one looks at the map, it is not really a viable geographical area anymore. It's an archipelago of patches of land which are no longer connected to each other. And E1 and E2 would, in many ways, represent the final nail in the coffin of the two-state solution, in my view. Building on E1 is more of a danger to the two-state outcome than the formal annexation of parts of the West Bank. It has long been seen by the UK, France and Germany as a red line. Another huge settlement plan of 7,000 units has been approved at Efrat, to the south of Bethlehem, often labelled E2. In both of these cases, the reality is that the Israeli government holds all the cards, while the Palestinian Authority has limited power and must rely on international solidarity. Those who take a more sympathetic view of the actions of the Israeli government will no doubt point to the so-called Abraham Accords, which were signed by the UAE and Bahrain at the White House on the 13th of August this year, and which commit those states to the normalisation of relations with Israel. Yet the reality is that the Abraham Accords are simply the formalisation of pre-existing and well-established relations between the signatories. These states have been working together for years on joint military operations, coups and counter-revolutions. For the Palestinian people, nothing has changed. The reality is the creeping annexation of their land continuing, and it is accelerating. Mr. Deputy Speaker, actions speak louder than words. The question that we must therefore address today is how the British government can use its position as a leading member of the international community to press the Israeli government to pull back from creeping annexation and to re-engage in talks on the basis of a viable two-state solution. The problem we face is that the deadlock will continue as long as Israel rejects any deal that includes Jerusalem, that does not mean Israel keeps the Jordan Valley, that rejects a sovereign viable Palestinian state, and will negotiate only on the basis of a plan that annexes occupied territory and includes total security control on any Palestinian entity, including control of all borders. Israel must drop these preconditions. There have been already some attempts by European states to assert their influence. For instance, 11 states, including the UK, Germany and France, joined in a démarche to the Israeli Foreign Ministry on the 1st of May, opposing Netanyahu's annexation plans. But together, the international community must go further. I will give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and he's making such a powerful speech and very balanced and considered. Does he, just on that point about the international response, is there an opportunity with the accords that have been struck with the UAE and Bahrain that somehow the UK government working with them and with Europe to gain extra leverage to bring about some sort of change in Israeli policy?
I thank my honourable friend, and it is absolutely a step in the right direction, although I think it needs to be taken with a pinch of salt for the reasons that I've set out. But the reality is that as long as the basis for these talks is the so-called Trump-Netanyahu plan, I am afraid it's a non-starter, because that plan violates international law. We should explore the potential for the International Criminal Court to play a role. The Israeli Attorney General's office has already warned the Israeli Prime Minister that annexation could trigger an investigation, and I quote, of senior army officers, civil service officials and heads of regional councils of West Bank settlements. It is essential that the UK condemns any further creeping annexation, but condemnation alone will never be enough. To this end, the UK government must take the following steps with urgency. First, it must immediately recognise the state of Palestine on the basis of the 1967 lines. The UK government argues that recognition should follow successful negotiations, but the logic of this argument is deeply flawed and partisan. It suggests that we are happy to see a 53-year-old occupation persist, legitimising the illegal actions of the Israeli government and contributing to the brutality and violence that shames us all. Second, the government must ban all products that originate from Israeli settlements in the occupied territories. Profiting from these products is tantamount to profiting from the proceeds of crime, and it must stop. When we trade with these settlements, we are essentially telling the world that international law does not matter, and such trade legitimises and facilitates the existence and expansion of the settlements. In 2014, it was right that the UK, as part of the European Union, prohibited trade with Crimea, following its illegal annexation by Russia. It is crucial that we are consistent in our application of international law. Third, the government must act to end the involvement of UK-based companies within the illegal settlements. In March, the UN published a list of companies that are involved in the settlements, which included JCB, Opodo and Greencoat. Charities actively involved in illegal settlement projects should not be eligible for the privileges of charitable status, including tax exemption. What steps will our government now be taking to hold these companies and charities to account? I look forward to hearing the Minister's views on these points. These measures must be put in place immediately. No more excuses, no more obfuscation from this government. Mr. Deputy Speaker, standing here in this chamber today, it is easy to forget the human cost of this conflict. Visiting the West Bank and East Jerusalem with Labour Friends of Palestine in the Middle East and the Council for Arab-British Understanding in 2014, I saw how the settlements touched the lives of those in the occupied territories. I think of the father from Gaza I met in Makassed hospital, nursing his 4-year-old double-amputee son, worrying about his wife in another hospital 20 miles away, who had also had both of her legs amputated. I think of the Bedouin community of al-Ahmar, residents living in perpetual fear of military demolitions and harassment. I think of the 250,000 children across the Palestinian territories who the UN identifies in need of psychosocial support and child protection interventions. What future can these children look forward to? What hope can we offer them? A 10-year-old child in Gaza will already have witnessed 3 wars and nothing but the siege. I therefore rise today to convey this simple message to the Minister. Act now. Act now to show that Britain is still a country that will give voice to the voiceless and to stand up for the rights of the oppressed. Act now to show that Britain is still a beacon of hope, a country that stands tall in the world and strives relentlessly for peace and justice. Act now to help us to believe that yours is a government that still believes in the rule of law. Thank you.